who is under the most pressure for the Pittsburgh Penguins heading into the season? I'll dive into that with Matt Gajtka right after this.
You're Locked On Penguins, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Penguins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am your host, Hunter Hodes. Remember to follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. Follow the show's Twitter at LONShow Penguins. And of course, thank you all so much for making this your first listen/watch of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. You can make every moment more. Don't miss the chance to get your first no sweat first bet up to $200 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/locked on. Joining me now is Matt Gajtka of Pittsburgh Sports, now in Pittsburgh Sports Live, former Penguins reporter for DK Pittsburgh Sports. Him and I go way back to the fan-sided days, Matt, if you remember that pretty nicely. But really appreciate you hopping on here for the Wednesday edition of the show.
Yeah, it's been at least 10 years, hasn't it? I feel like somewhere around there when I was running City of Champions Sports and you were one of our writers and reporters. So I'd just call it an even decade. And thanks for having me on the show. I know it's late July, so you bring on the big guns to figure out something to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost August. We are truly in the dog days of the off season, but there's still content to make and things to talk about. And speaking of that, discussing with you who is under the most pressure for the Penguins heading into this season. My first player that I would say outside of Tristan Jarry, that's an obvious one to say, so I'm going to put that out there, is yes, Jarry's under a lot of pressure. But outside of that, I would say if he's on the team, Jeff Petry. I thought he was fine during the season. I don't think he was anything spectacular. I just thought he was overpaid for the work that he put in, $6.25 million after coming over from the Montreal Canadiens. He was okay at breaking the puck out of the defensive zone, was okay in the offensive zone. I didn't really like his play on the power play. It's funny, when you look at the underlyings, they paid him out to have had a much better season than what I thought. Ranks in the 66th percentile for 5-on-5 offense, 55th percentile for 5-on-5 defense. Yet, when I watched him this past season, I saw someone who wasn't that good of a fit in Mike Sullivan's system, even when playing with Marcus Pettersson. And I saw someone who also, I think the wheels are starting to fall off with him. I don't think he was awful or anything. I just don't think the Penguins got what they were hoping for in the deal when they acquired him. Same here with me. I thought he was going to be awesome when he came over, but I think he's under a lot of pressure heading into the year if he is still on the team and whatever, not with Erik Karlsson. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose we have to put a caveat, an asterisk by this one, because if they get Karlsson, Petry's likely gone, I think. He'd be one of the contracts moved the way to San Jose. But if he is coming back, I agree with your assessment. I thought, eye test-wise, I just wasn't impressed. I remember him scoring some big goals against the Penguins in particular, one in the playoffs in the bubble a few years back. But generally speaking, him using his big shot to great effect and being an offensive dynamo. And I just didn't feel like I was seeing that. Yes, as you said, there was more good than bad that happened with him on the ice this past season. Maybe just suffered some bad finishing luck, maybe some bad goaltending luck as well, a combination of both. The one thing with Petry, though, Hunter, is that as long as Chris Letang is on this team, he's just not going to get that much power play time because they're going to play four forwards more often than not. And so it's going to be Letang on the first unit. And we all know the first unit gets about a minute 20 to a minute 30 to a minute 40, something like that on every given power play. So it's just not, the conditions aren't where they were for him in Montreal to shine a bit. Kyle Dubas talked about his training. Maybe he needs to adjust his training and how he goes about his business off the ice as he gets into his mid-30s in order to maintain that explosiveness, because they talk about how good of an athlete he is. And I'm just not sure I really saw that in his first season, maybe only season as a Penguin.
Yeah, I didn't really think his skating was there either. I always thought he was a bit step slow in the defensive zone, whether he was going one-on-one against a forward or whether he was behind the net working on a forward. I just always thought he was a step slow in the defensive zone. Just kind of meh from him this past season. And yeah, sometimes the power play is on there for 80 to 90 seconds, but also, Matt, I feel like a lot of times Mike Sullivan will put the first power play out for only 55 seconds to a minute, especially if the unit is not really doing anything, especially not gaining the zone, because we all know how bad the Penguins are at gaining the zone on the power play with that stupid drop pass that they do that they just have to get rid of. But if that continues, you could see Petry on the power play more this upcoming season, but in a perfect world, you're only seeing him out there for, 30 to 35 seconds with the second unit. Another player who I do think is under pressure heading into the season is Bryan Rust. 20 goals this past season, 46 points in 81 games. And you might look at that and say, oh, that's not that bad of production for someone who plays in the top six. But when you look at his numbers compared to last season, when he had 58 points in 60 games, yes, he missed 20 plus games that season before, it feels like a step down. And he's now at the age range where it can go at any time. That's the biggest thing. And I'm concerned about that heading into the season. His shooting percentage plummeted this past year. I hope that rebounds heading into this upcoming season. But if he's still kind of playing at the level that we saw from him this past year and the next season, I don't know, Matt. I think he could find himself potentially off this team pretty soon, even though he has the full no move clause. So he dictates where he wants to go with that long-term contract. I just wasn't fully impressed with him this past season. I want to bounce back considering how great he has been for the organization, but he's under pressure to perform because I don't think it was good enough this past season.
Yeah, Rose is an interesting case because I've always felt like he gets more out of his talent than maybe he should. And I'm not sure what to attribute that to. Maybe because he plays a pretty direct game, it's harder for that type of game to go into a slump. But he did go into a shooting slump this past year. Didn't finish nearly at the rate at what we're used to. I think underlyings were pretty close to what he has been at during what should be his prime. But as you mentioned, we're getting toward the back end of the prime now, at least as it has been for most NHL players over the past 20, 30 years. So I agree with you there. Here's one that might sound obvious, but I think for me, it is the player with the most pressure, and that's Sidney Crosby. This whole thing is built on him maintaining at least a point per game pace, you'd have to imagine. And he has found, it's another worldly level that he's found. It's otherworldly consistency, I should say, because, yeah, he's not quite at the McDavid level. He's not quite at the tip top of offensive producers anymore, but he's in that 5 to 10 range, and he's essentially been there for like 7 or 8 years. He's extended out his prime beyond what anyone could have ever imagined. And it's a credit to his dedication. It's credit to, I think, also his hockey mind. He's able to maybe make up for perhaps a little bit of a drop-off physically with just knowing so much about hockey and refining every little aspect of his skill set. So full credit to him there. But like I just said at the top of this is built. This whole concept of bringing in Dubas here to try to get one more squeeze out of this orange, it's built on Crosby staying at the very least in that 5 to 10 range in the NHL in terms of top offensive producers. And he's about to turn 35, if I do the quick math, or actually 36, pardon me, 2023 from 87. So 36, that's pretty old for an NHL player. And you've got Malkin there as well. You've got Letang there on top. But both of those guys are important, but they're not as important as Crosby because he continues to carry the load. He continues to drive this ship, pick your metaphor. And I just really wonder how much more we can expect out of this guy. It's been nearly 2 decades.
I agree. And I'll honestly go a step further, Matt, and say that the pressure's on the other 2 big guns as well, of getting Malkin and Chris Letang. I don't think Letang had the season that he wanted to have this past season, and for obvious reasons. The guy had a stroke. His dad passed away. He was banged up at times. But he needs to show that he can play at the level that he showed when he came back from all that. Because I thought down the stretch, Letang played I think it was his best hockey of the season. He looked like the Chris Letang from last season, the season before, and the season before. So honestly, again, I would take it a step further and say this whole ship is predicated on all 3 of them performing at an elite level. Because if they don't, the season can go down the drain fairly quickly. If you have anyone else that's under pressure heading into the season, Matt, I'll hand the floor over to you before we get to our next topic.
I'm going to go non-player, Mike Sullivan. I think he's got to, this is so cliched, make some adjustments. That's what everyone wants him to do. Make some adjustments with the heavy air quotes. And sometimes I think that's a little overblown. Hockey it's a player's game. It's not so much a coach's game. This isn't football where you're drawing up plays every 10 seconds. You've got to rely on the players to both make the plays and to execute the system, but also to go outside the system when things break down and figure out a way to get things done. And I think in a large extent, the players have let Sullivan down over the past 2 or 3 years. But we'll also see how he adjusts to a roster that has a little more depth. I'm not sure I was totally blown away by the first offseason, the first free agency session for Kyle Dubas. But I think it's unmistakable that he's raised the floor of this group. You're not going to see a huge fall off. And I guess to borrow another football reference, you're not going to be losing the battle of field position as much as you were last year, where you're relying on Crosby and Malkin to dig your way out of the defensive zone and push play back into the offensive zone. Chris Letang's a big part of that too, as well. Maybe the most important part as a defenseman. So there is that to factor in. But I think Sully is reaching the point now. It's a tipping point season for me with him because I've given him a break here for a couple of years just because I feel like his body of work speaks for itself. But at a certain point, the body of work starts to turn a little bit sour. And we just haven't seen the results in the big moments from his team that we did in his first 2, heck, maybe 3 seasons until they were knocked out by the Caps in the second round in 2018.
I do think that's fair. Don't get me wrong. I will say he has had some goaltending issues that really haven't been his fault. He hasn't gotten at least average goaltending in a lot of these playoff series. You go back to 2021 with Tristan Jarry. You go back to last year with Louis Domingue. Even before that in the bubble with Matt Murray, he didn't play that well. And 2018-19 with the Islanders, sure, Robin Lehner played out of his mind, but Matt Murray was just kind of there in that sweep. And honestly, I'll kind of put that sweep on everyone's shoulders. The team was absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, that was the good 21. Jack Johnson was still playing. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying. I do think this is a big year for him. I don't think he's in serious jeopardy of losing his job, but that can certainly change at the end of the season, especially if the Penguins don't make the playoffs. I think playoffs are bust for sure right now. I mean, you have to make the playoffs this upcoming season. Missing them 2 seasons in a row, that is not an option for this franchise, especially in the twilight years of the Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and Chris Letang era. That wraps up this first segment. Coming up in the second, what are some realistic expectations for Reilly Smith, Kyle Dubas' first big move that he made before free agency? Matt and I are going to dive into that. But before we discuss that, take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first amount of bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 of bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to get the first home run in the game. And it's all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 of bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball and Locked On. All right, I'm back in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I am your host, Hunter Hodes. Remember to follow me on Twitter at Hunter Hodes. Follow the show's Twitter at @LONStarPenguins. And of course, thank you all so much for making this your first listen/watch of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. So as I teased heading into this segment, Dubas' first move was made during the draft. Reilly Smith to the Penguins for a 3rd-round pick. It's funny, Matt, that pick was originally acquired in the Teddy Bluger trade. So in essence, the Penguins traded for Reilly Smith and traded away Teddy Bluger. Coming into this season, I think he can definitely outperform Jason Zucker, especially in areas of transition. In my opinion, I think Smith is a better player in transition than Zucker was. You're going to get more goals from Smith off the rush than you did with Zucker. Zucker, obviously he can fire it from anywhere on the ice, but he was also really good in front of the net or just in that high danger area, 10 to 15 feet out. He scored so many of his goals this past season in that area. Smith, he can do that, but his greatest asset is scoring off the rush, I think, in my opinion. He'll also give you great play on the penalty kill. He has been awesome on the PK throughout his career, ranks in the 84th percentile for penalty killing among all forwards in the NHL. He's definitely going to give them a big boost in that. I'll actually go a step further and say that he's going to lead the Penguins in shorthanded goals this upcoming season. All that said, I think he's probably going to be in that 25 to 30 goal range. I think he can hit 30 goals, even though he is above 30 years old. He has the talent. He's going from playing in the top 6 in Vegas to playing in the top 6 in Pittsburgh, likely with Evgeny Malkin and one of Bryan Rust or Rickard Rakell. When you look at Smith, what are some expectations that you have for him this upcoming season?
Well, first of all, I want to say fairly well to Jason Zucker, because I felt for him when his injuries were a huge issue when he first got to Pittsburgh, and I felt like there was potential there for him to break out and have a big season, and he did. So I'm happy for him. I don't know if I'm happy for his destination necessarily. We'll see how that pans out. But the Reilly Smith acquisition was Kyle Dubas's concession to a salary cap league. You just probably weren't going to keep Zucker. So to go get Smith, I think is about as good as you can do. And like you said, he's a different style of player, and maybe that rush opportunism, if you want to call it that, will fill in some gaps in the Penguins where there were some weaknesses this past year. It's a team that's getting older, so typically older teams don't do so great off the rush, at least when it comes to generating things offensively. So Smith adds something there. Expectation-wise, I'm a little cautious on it just because I don't think he's a pure finisher. But much like Jason Zucker, he's had those seasons in his career where you can point to and say, well, when he stays healthy, when he's on the ice, when he's playing with a good team, he produces. So I think where Zucker was points-wise this past year was a pretty good projection. I don't know if it's going to be a one-for-one replacement, and it's going to be tough to replace the energy and the enthusiasm that Zucker brought to us. But Reilly Smith is just a competent hockey player, and he's not too old where you really fear a huge drop-off. He's in that Bryan Rust zone that you talked about earlier. So Smith, we've seen him play. We saw him be an intriguing player for Florida, and then we saw him blossom in Vegas. And hey, it doesn't hurt that he had that recent experience of winning. He's going to have the hunger to repeat for sure, but I think also the hunger to prove that, hey, I'm not over the hill just because the Knights dropped me off to the Pens.
I agree with that for sure. And I also think he'll give them some good value on the power play. I know Jason was not really on power play 1 very much. It's because the Penguins have better forwards than him that they can put out there on the first power play. You combine that with Crystal Tang. But Smith can really replace Zucker on the second power play. Again, he's not going to be like that net front presence that maybe some fans are looking for, but he's going to be someone that can really fire the puck, 20, 25 feet away. And I think someone who probably will have the best shot on that unit, in my opinion.
Yeah, you bring up penalty kill too. That's been maybe a secret or a low-key sore subject for the Penguins. At least it was last year. They had previously been pretty good under Mike Sullivan, penalty killing wise. Some of that's goaltending, of course. The cliche that your goaltender has to be your best PKer. I think to a large degree that does pan out. And Jarry's save percentage shorthanded and DeSmith's save percentage shorthanded just didn't cut the mustard in the second half of last season. But I think we can all agree they could afford to give up less high danger chances, less cross crease passes, cross slot passes, the type of plays that often lead to glorious scoring opportunities. The Penguins could do a better job. And you're looking at guys like Lars Eller as well to try to carry some of that load. But Reilly Smith is also a piece of that puzzle.
I agree with that for sure. And definitely on the penalty kill, Matt, because too many times this past season, I thought the Penguins were way too passive on the PK. I always thought they let the opposition get in way too freely. The zone entries were easily allowed, and then the opposition can just set up, go east-west, back to the point, get to the slot, boom, puck is in the back of the net. There are so many instances this season where the Penguins PK lost them games late in third periods because the PK wasn't able to do its job. Sure, the goaltending aspect of that is also big. Tristan Jarry was not good on the PK this season. Casey DeSmith was not good on the PK this season. But adding Smith to that is going to make a difference. And I think the Penguins will have at least a couple extra points this upcoming season just because of his impact on the PK and why he's one of the better penalty killing forwards in today's game.
Like I said, he's just a competent hockey player. He's solid at both ends of the ice. And you can expect him to do his job more often than not when he's out there. And the Penguins had a few players last year who that was not the case for, whether they be young or old. Honestly, it wasn't necessarily exclusively an age problem. It wasn't exclusively a rookies or young players problem. It was just they didn't have enough good players. There was a quality problem across the board for the Pens. So at the very least, you lose Zucker, but it's a fairly identical, not identical, but it's pretty close to that patch for the Pens and for Dubas to get Reilly Smith, like you said, for not much in the end. It ends up being essentially a straight up trade for Teddy Bluger, who really didn't even play for the Knights at the end of their cup run. He's probably a 4th/5th line NHLer on a good team.
I agree with that too, but that wraps up this second segment, diving into Reilly Smith. Again, really looking forward to watching him play. He hasn't spoken to the media yet, but I think that's going to be coming at some point. But really looking forward to seeing what he can do in the top 6 on the penalty kill and on the second power play unit. Coming up to end the show, going to dive into a pretty fun topic with Matt. What if the Penguins selected Patrice Bergeron in the 2003 NHL draft just because Bergeron retired from the NHL on Tuesday? That's coming up right after this. All right, we're back in this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I'm Hunter Hodes. That is Matt Gajtka. So, Matt, you saw it. The whole hockey world saw Patrice Bergeron announce his retirement from the NHL on Tuesday, capping off a wonderful 19-year career. In my opinion, he's the best defensive forward of this generation. He was absolutely spectacular at both ends of the rink. I hated when the Penguins would go up against the Bruins just because Bergeron would always do such a great job of shutting down Sidney Crosby. And in that 2013 series, I'll say it here, Patrice Bergeron had Sidney Crosby in his back pocket. That is just how much of nothing that Sid did in that series. And I know the Penguins didn't really show up in that series as a whole. Tuukka Rask was over .950 when it comes to save percentage. But the work that Bergeron did on Crosby in that series was unbelievable. And the Penguins only beat the Bruins 8 total times when Bergeron was in the lineup in Boston. That's just how bad the Penguins struggled against that team. But I loved watching him. 6 Selke trophies. They should honestly rename the award after him. He won it 6 times, was nominated 12 times. I could watch him on an everyday basis shut down the opposing team's best lines. And when you think about it, the Penguins, Matt, they had a chance to draft him in the 2003 NHL draft. That was the draft that the Penguins selected Marc-Andre Fleury, number 1 overall. Penguins then had the number 32 overall pick in the second round, and they took center Ryan Stone of the Brandon Wheat Kings. He only played 35 games, 7 points in those games. He was out of the NHL in 2009-10. Bergeron did not go until the number 45 overall pick by the Bruins. When you look back at that today, had the Penguins taken Bergeron, much would have been different because you look at the standings for that season and the production Bergeron had, Bergeron would have been 5th on the team in scoring, 4th among all forwards. Penguins finished with 58 points, 1 less than the Capitals. I believe it was the Blackhawks as well. Does Bergeron get them an extra win there or two to not have them get Evgeny Malkin in that lottery or not have them get Sidney Crosby in the 2005 lottery? I think that's a discussion worth having, and it's a fun one to have at that.
Yeah, Bergeron was a late bloomer. Looking at his stats, he wasn't that two-way dynamo until about the 2009, 2010, 2011 Stanley Cup championship season for Boston. At that point, he went on an incredible run, redefining what a two-way player means in the NHL, providing just as much offense as he prevented at the other end. So, first of all, kudos to him for taking the Selke conversation to a new level. It used to be guys like Guy Carbonneau never scored, but or rarely scored. But now it's about you have to produce at both ends if you want to win the Selke, and that's largely attributable to Bergeron's career. But he was not that player early on. He was a sub 50% faceoff guy. I think faceoffs a lot with Bergeron. I think two-way excellence, just looking at some rough numbers, obviously plus minus, but he was a minus 20 something in 2006-07. So the Bruins weren't very good. He wasn't very good. It took him a while to really find his legs, unlike a Crosby or a Malkin. But I think unmistakably, you put him in that lineup for the Pens. He probably plays a ton, first of all, because he's going to be on that first line because of his quality, which would have been evident right away. And you have to figure he gets him at least a few more points in the standings, which changes the lottery math, of course, which ultimately could change the big lottery math from 2005 when the Pens won the jackpot of all jackpots. So butterfly effect. That's why it's so weird sometimes that leagues like the NHL with the reverse order draft, which every league does it in North America, at some level it encourages bad decisions until you get to that tipping point where you have to start making good decisions. But those bad decisions can help get you in a position to make great decisions. So it's a weird thing to try to analyze. People like me who like things to make sense all the time, it hurts my brain. But in that case, the Penguins picking Ryan Stone probably helped them, quote unquote, get to where they wanted to go, which was the plan with the X generation in the first place.
It helped them win not just the 04 lottery, even though they didn't technically get the number 1 overall pick. They still won it when they got Evgeny Malkin. Then obviously
winning was finishing. If you finished last, you were going to get someone great that year because you were going to get second place at worst, which the Penguins did. Yeah,
of course. And, say the Penguins still finished with the same record had Bergeron been the pick, right? I'm just hypothetical here. Say they still finished with that record. I believe it was 23 and 47 and 8, something like that, 58 points. Say they still get Malkin. Say they still get Crosby. Now going into the 2006 NHL draft where the Penguins took Jordan Staal, I don't think the Penguins take him there. I think they are set up to have Crosby and especially Bergeron be that lockdown two-way center for the foreseeable future, like Staal was until he was traded to Carolina to play with his brother. You still have Evgeny Malkin. Man, watching that core, Matt, with Sergei Gonchar and all those guys, that would have been quite a lot of fun. And, do they beat Detroit if they play them in 09? Do they beat them in 08? What happens in 2007 when they go up against the Ottawa Senators? If that even happens, there's just a whole multitude of things that could happen if that were the case. And also, I should have added this as well. Penguins took Chris Letang in the third round of the 2005 NHL draft. So do they still get him? I mean, would have been really fun to see the big three plus Bergeron, but then also they don't get Staal, but then you take away Staal's moments in the 09 Cup final. Whole bunch of different scenarios there. But I definitely think had they drafted Bergeron, had Malkin and Crosby been there and had the Penguins won those, quote unquote, won those lotteries, especially the 05 one, and they got Chris Letang, I do not think they would have taken Jordan Staal.
No, and I think ultimately you run into the same problem you ran into with Staal, which is that he wanted to play more. He deserved to play more, and he wasn't even as good as Bergeron. So if you have Crosby, Malkin, Bergeron down the middle, that's only going to last for a few years. It would have been a few great years to watch, and maybe they pick up another cup along the way in those early Crosby, Malkin years. But it was only going to be 5 or 6 seasons, and then you would have had to move on and find a way to get some value for, I would presume, Bergeron moving on, but who knows what the decision might have been made there by ex-GM Ray Shero. So the lesson is in a salary cap league, in a league where there's only one puck to go around as well, you can't compile that level of all-star team without someone being a little bit upset or someone wanting more opportunities. And when you have an embarrassment of riches at that position at center, like the Penguins would have had, or actually did have with Crosby, Malkin, and Staal, it's a situation where you just try to make some hay while the sun shines and take advantage of those early entry-level years.
Everything all worked out in the end, which is great. I will add this on Bergeron before we wrap up here, though, Matt. Again, loved watching him play, but I think deep down, even though Sidney Crosby's won 3 Stanley Cups, he's beaten almost all the Penguins' rivals at least once in a series. I think deep down, he wishes he could have taken down Bergeron and Marchand at least once in a series. And I know we only saw it once, and it went really poorly. And I also wish the Penguins would have played the Bruins one more time in a series. But I think deep down, Sid is wishing, man, if only I could have played him one more time and beaten him in a series, that would have given him, just the, what's the word I'm looking for here? I don't want to say like trifecta, but just like the situation where he's beaten all of the rival teams at least once in a series, whether that's the Islanders, whether that's the Rangers, the Flyers, the Blue Jackets, Washington, then you add the Bruins there. They beat the Hurricanes, obviously. But that would have given him.
They beat the Rangers. Yeah, they've really beaten any team that has been a contender or pseudo contender since they've come up. It's just luck of the draw, right? The two teams did not have concurrent good playoff seasons except for 2013, and that went way too quickly. Even though all those games, well, most of those games were close and could have gone either way. 3 out of 4 of them could, at the very least. Yeah, I was always rooting for that, but if they do get together now, it'll be a different look, and it'll be a little bit lesser without Patrice Bergeron. But Sid versus Marchand, his buddy from the Maritime provinces, his workout buddy in the summer too. I think that would be really compelling. Remember, they teamed up for a fantastic first line for Team Canada in the World Cup in 2016, last time we had best on best.
That's right. And there was also a time, Matt, where everyone in this city was hoping that Brad Marchand was going to become an unrestricted free agent and then come to Pittsburgh to play with Crosby. Did not happen, of course, because he extended in Boston. He's going to remain there for the rest of his career. But, that would still also be fun. I know Brad Marchand riles people up around here. But overall, Patrice, congratulations on a wonderful career. In my opinion, I think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. Again, the best defensive forward of my lifetime, or of my generation, I should say. And all the best to him in retirement. But that will wrap up today's episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. Matt, tell everyone where they can follow you and just what's coming up with your work.
I was going to say, follow me on Twitter. Maybe it's called X by the time this show gets out. Anyway, Matt Gajtka, there you see my name under there. Remember to take a screenshot because it's hard to spell from memory, I'm sure. But that's basically me on all social media accounts where I post all my work. I'll be back at it with some Penguins postgame shows on Pittsburgh Sports Live this upcoming fall. I just started to miss hockey this week. I realized, I would love to have a game to talk about tonight, but we'll have to wait another couple of months. Also continue to run Pittsburgh Golf Now from afar. That's part of the Pittsburgh Sports Now family of websites. So look for our various content on the sport that I love to play, especially this time of year. A great time to take your mind off hockey and hit the links. So that's where you can find me. And like I said, just general nonsense as well on social media. But thanks, Hunter, for having me on. First time on your show, I think, at least on this show in particular. And good to get my hockey fixed here in the middle of, getting toward late July, as we still have some wilderness to trudge our way through here before we get to training camp.
I believe the last time you were on the show was almost 2 years ago, I think, at this point, when I think we did like a home and home or something like that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We did do that. Okay, I take it back. But it has been a while. So thanks for the invitation, and hope everyone enjoyed the show, putting the minds together here, trying to come up with some stuff.
Yes. Thank you all so much for listening / watching this episode of the Locked On Penguins podcast. I very much appreciate it. I should have the new co-host on by Friday.
Ooh.
You all want to keep guessing who it is in the comments or in my DMs? Go ahead. I only saw one person who was guessed. Keep guessing other people. But I just want to see who people can come up with, to say the least. But should hopefully have him by Friday. If not Friday, then definitely next week. But again, thank you all so much for listening to / watching this episode of the podcast. Hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll talk with you all again on Friday.